What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Happiness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Ravn, and we speak about self-determination theory and facilitation as a life skill to facilitate social interactions. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, lean back to be inspired. Hello, Ib. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm glad to have you here to geek out a little bit about facilitation and self-determination theory. And before we're getting there, I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Well, in a sense, I don't. I'm much concerned with facilitation. And I think of myself as somebody who does facilitation. But taking on that identity as facilitator hasn't really occurred to me or hasn't been that particularly important to me. But I like to think that I train people to become facilitators. That I do a lot.
That's an interesting edge to train someone to become a facilitator and still not calling yourself a facilitator.
Exactly. That's strange, isn't it? How about a trainer of facilitators? That yes. I could identify with.
Yes. How much do you use your facilitation and training?
Well, since what I train mostly is facilitation, I use facilitation in that training. So like yesterday, I had 22 people together in a room for 6 hours and structuring that whole process, helping them understand and practice what meeting facilitation is. I, of course, use facilitation because that 6-hour process is, in a sense, a meeting. Only it's a meeting or a workshop that deals with, how do the participants become better facilitators? And of course, the training session has to be facilitated, very much so, by me. And I do that. And people notice that along the way. And occasionally we talk about it. Did you notice what I just did? That sort of thing.
Yeah, isn't it nice that in a facilitation training, we can basically constantly switch between the meta level and the actual facilitation?
Yes. That's what I find very pleasant about teaching facilitation, because it is sort of what I'm doing right now is what I'm teaching you also. So that everything I do becomes exemplary. It is something to be looked at, and I'm sort of practicing what I preach, or at least I try to do. So that's a very good arena for showing other people what facilitation is like, because they're very attuned to facilitation skills, which they might not be in a workshop or a meeting that is about something else, because then their attention is focused on that other subject, that something else. But here the subject is facilitation. So the whole day is spent sort of in meta level reflection and looking at what I do and exercises when they try to do that themselves.
Yeah. According to you, what is the maybe most underrated facilitation skill?
Well, I can tell you that. And I consider the most important and not so much talked about part of facilitation is not this whole business about including and opening up and ensuring participation. But when you take facilitation into the meeting, the regular everyday meeting, the nuts and bolts of many organizations, when you take facilitation into that space, what becomes very important is helping people move along. Denmark, where I operate, is a very democratic and egalitarian country. And for the past 50 years or so, we've had meetings that are very inclusive. Everybody gets to speak. We have a dogma called the word is free. It doesn't translate so well, but it means you can say, we can speak whatever is on your mind. And this is what people do at meetings. So very important facilitation skills becomes how to guide a meeting through this sea of contributions, everybody wanting to speak and expecting to be allowed to speak and speak their minds about pretty much anything. So Danish meetings are a very open forum compared to meetings in many other countries, and how to navigate through this forum and help people shorten their contributions and get to the point and not stray off focus, and politely and diplomatically helping people reach a goal by focusing their minds on this particular topic. So that thing about helping people focus their conversation, that's an underrated facilitation skill, I would say.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I would bet that many in the audience would consider this a luxury problem, to have too many people who actually want to contribute and to have this openness and inclusivity as a default. And this just raises my awareness how much facilitation needs cultural awareness. Exactly. And how much we have to adapt and adjust to the context that we are bringing to the room and our participants have.
Exactly.
And I wonder, do you then in the Danish culture also have this openness that you can tell people to speak less or to come to a point? Or is it more of the polite culture? So are you more on the Dutch side or more on the British side of politeness?
Danes are generally not considered very polite because we don't have the elegant forms of speech that Brits have, or we skipped those 50 years ago, and we're more blunt and direct. But that's not really so in the meeting when it comes to focusing the conversation, because we have another democratic or respectful or egalitarian principle, and that is which is well known in other, well-behaved cultures as well, and that is don't interrupt other people. So that's sort of a prohibition that other people should be able to speak their minds, and maybe that goes along with the democratic, or that's just a general concern. And it's a very nice principle. And when you're 4 years old, your parents teach you, don't interrupt the grown-ups when they speak. And then for the rest of our lives, we try to be grown up and try to allow other people to speak their minds and complete their sentences and not jump in. And then when these people when Danes then become facilitators, many people who are drawn to that profession or that skill are people who are very attentive and very good listeners and very inclusive of mind. And that means that when they get together in a meeting and there are people who exert themselves and try to express themselves very much, then these, I would call them timid facilitators, don't really interrupt and are shy to do so. So even though we may be blunt, and that's in a way, that's part of my facilitator training, that is, how can you interrupt other people, not in a blunt or impolite way, but in a very polite and acknowledging and respectful and diplomatic way. So that's usually I have a module, like an hour's worth or so during a training, where we practice the skill of interrupting somebody who speaks off topic in a very polite and inclusive way.
Do you have one tip for the listeners? I think this might be the number one challenge of many.
Yeah, I think it is too. I have a whole bunch of tips. And if I can just give you the most discreet, when you have a topic, you're talking about topic A, and then somebody starts speaking and gradually develops into topic B, because that other topic is at the forefront of that person's mind. Then the first simple thing a facilitator can do is not to say, hey, you're talking about B and you're not supposed to do that. That's too much. All you need to do really is to say, B. Like yesterday, we had an exercise where I set the group up to talk about a department, a regular organization, and they have sort of a little kitchen space, and it's always very messy in that kitchen space. So let's talk about how do we take responsibility for cleaning up this kitchen space. And then somebody who might instruct it, to do this, jumped in and say, well, we really need to talk about our team spirit and the whole psychological security in our department, because that's really failing. That's a much bigger and much more important issue than about cleaning up. And I said simply, team spirit. And then she babbled on as she was supposed to. This was an exercise. Then I said, but cleaning up the kitchen. And then when I told the other attendees was that, but just by pointing out the new topic that is being brought up by the other person, that other person may not really realize that this is a different topic. So it's simply by saying it and alerting that person's and the other people in the room, their attention to the fact that a new topic has entered the conversation is a forewarning that if that doesn't straighten itself up, then later, like 30 seconds later, I will jump in again and help the person return to the topic a bit more directly, more than discreetly. So mentioning the other topic and reminding everybody of the original topic, those are two very discreet interventions that can be said very quietly and smiling and so on, like inquiring in a way, but alerting people to the fact that I am the facilitator. I am monitoring everything that is being said around this table. And when it's no longer on target, I will do something, but I will do it very discreetly to begin with. So I'm not even saying you can't talk about this, you must talk about that. I'm just mentioning the new topics. And if these people know me, they also know, okay, Ib is waking up. He's getting on track now. He will be more forceful 20 seconds later on this, unless this person returns to the topic. So that's one simple tip.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I find it beautiful because it also exemplifies some other facilitation skills, like making the implicit explicit, which is so important. And you model that by highlighting what's happening implicitly and making it explicit.
That's actually a good principle. I usually think of that in terms of the facilitator must make it clear to the participants what the consequences of actions are, such that if a group is reluctant to make a decision about something and just wants to move on, then the facilitator has the responsibility to say, okay, if we don't make this decision right now, then these certain other things will happen. We may have to drop this project. And are you ready to go and inform the CEO that we have decided to drop this project at some later stage? Maybe they say, yes, we are. They think, whoa, gee, that's not what I want to do. So let's make this decision now. But you're saying making the implicit explicit. I like that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Would you elaborate that? What kinds of things are you thinking of when you're saying making the implicit explicit?
For instance, what I think about immediately are how we use certain words, and that we might not have the same definition of the words we are using.
Right.
Or if a decision is about to be made, are we, what are assumptions, and are these assumptions explicit to all, so that everyone knows what we're actually discussing or agreeing upon?
Right.
And I think especially for uncomfortable topics, it's very soothing for groups to hide behind buzzwords and assumed agreement, or just the illusion of agreement. Because if you then unpeel the onion, you realize that actually they are not.
Right. So that's a nice task for a facilitator, to bring those unsaid things into the open and take on this responsibility of making it clear to everyone what we're actually talking about.
And I think in order to be able to do that, the facilitator really needs to listen to these nuances and maybe listen to what's not said and to the atmosphere of the group in order to then voice it, first to sense it and then to voice it.
Right.
Yeah.
Good point.
Thank you. In our exploration call, you said a beautiful sentence that we must facilitate every social interaction.
Right.
And what I hear when you said that was facilitation is actually more than a meeting skill. Facilitation is actually a life skill that everyone needs to be trained at.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
Well, sort of along the lines that you just indicated, that to become aware of what we're actually doing when we are interacting socially and not just go along with hidden assumptions and convention, but get on top of things and make things clear. What are we doing here? And then changing course if that needs to be done. And that's the mandate that a facilitator has when we're in a meeting or a workshop and I'm sitting at the end of the table and I can do these things. That mandate is not usually visible or had at all in social interactions where we are quite often rather equal in a conversation or four friends sitting around a table or a dinner conversation or meeting people in the street or going to PTA meetings at school with parents and teachers and so on. So all those social spaces quite often, I think, need some reflection and some redesign. That's a big word, but at least that you go in and look at how has this been done for the past 5 or 50 years? And is this a proper form, or should we change the form, the process a little? And that's the sort of skill that a facilitator has, to look at process and form and think, okay, we have a content here, and that's about people talking or sharing a meal or doing stuff. Can we do this in a better way? And I think if you're putting on your facilitator's glasses, you will discover many social interactions that are deeply wanting and really needs some changing around.
Yes.
And one thing that occurs to me is right now, I did my undergraduate work in England. I'm a Danish citizen, and then my PhD in the States. And in both of those countries, I learned a lot about social interactions that was not a native to Danish culture, where, like the other Nordic countries, we are on the whole fairly sort of centered around our own stable little group of friends, and we don't look much to strangers. We don't include them. We don't see them. We don't talk to them. If you walk down a city street in the U.S., especially small towns, you are available for conversation, and people can address you even though you are a complete stranger, and you're supposed to answer. And Americans have learned to do this. It's not something that is inborn. It's not a native thing, but it's a cultural thing. But Danes haven't learned this. So when we walk in the street or go to the supermarket, we are totally and completely alone, even though surrounded by hundreds of other people, because they are not socially available to us. That's a very strange thing. So only people that you know can you actually talk to. And then the question arises, how do you get to know people? Well, you just generally don't. Or you stay at home at night when you're young and drink with your friends, and then you go out at midnight and you're so drunk that your inhibitions about talking to strangers have fallen away. And then you can have fun for the next 6 hours. And that's how social life, in many cases, at least at bars and parties and so on, happen in Denmark. And that certainly you can, ask, is that a productive or fruitful way to have social rules and mores and so on? And could we find ways of socializing and having parties that did not involve drinking so much that our inhibitions only fall when we have consumed 5 or 10 drinks?
Or if you have completed a facilitation training.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of social events, if they had a bit more facilitation, very discreetly, very elegantly, we could do away with a lot of the alcohol. And there are other cultures where you don't drink and people still socialize. I have a friend of Arabic origins, and I just talked to her last night, and she tells me about how she gets together with friends and they just start dancing after having drunk a couple of cups of tea, and that would be completely unheard of in Denmark. You need drink in order to socialize properly in Denmark. And that's why we have a huge youth drinking problem in this country, I think, because the cultural norms are such that it's very difficult to talk to strangers and to bond and to find a partner as you want to do when you're between 20 and 30.
Interesting. What came to my mind was the risk of over-facilitating. And
yes.
So now it's not as frequent anymore, but I had the phase where my friends would tell me, Miriam, please stop facilitating. Don't be such a facilitator. Or warn me, Miriam, please don't facilitate your date. And I think this can put our environments in very awkward situations. Because I think if we're in the role of a facilitator, suddenly our voice changes and there is this more kind of directive. And this would, I guess, lead or could lead to the opposite of opening up the social space.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether it's then more about the intentional design rather than the facilitation itself.
Well, but intentional design also requires, and I think what people notice when you or I start facilitating in a space that does not usually see facilitation, it's probably because we don't have the mandate. We have not been put in the position of, well, you're the facilitator. Why don't you guide us through this social occasion? This is what happens in meetings where it's nice to have a chairperson or a meeting manager or a facilitator. But in social situations, those things don't exist. Yes. You can have a host and you can have 9 friends over for dinner, but that doesn't mean that you're allowed to direct the conversation and say, now we have a plenary conversation and now we split up into groups and you two and you two and you two talk together. That's completely unheard of and silly in social situations, right? And if you start doing that, people will spot that immediately. I mean, if you do much, much less than that, if you have designs for people that way, they will feel slightly pushed around or nudged or manipulated. And they will say, hey, you're not at work. Relax. This is just social. So that's the challenge that one faces as a facilitator. So one certainly shouldn't overdo it. But there are aspects of facilitation that are sort of culturally well established already. And maybe they're more like meeting design, but like having a seating plan. If you have friends over for dinner, you have a seating plan, and that's completely culturally accepted. And people are usually pleased with not having to sit next to their spouse or their partner, which otherwise they might feel obliged to do so as not to leave the partner alone in this party of my friends. So the host will divide them and set them apart, and they can only reconnect hours later. Most people accept that. And I think social spaces in that way could be opened up for more facilitation. I suppose you know in your culture as well, you invite 50 people for an anniversary or a big birthday bash or a wedding or so, and then people will sit down and eat. And in our culture, people sit down and eat for 4 or 6 hours, and you're sitting next to the same 2 people on your left and your right, and one person across from you, and you're sitting there talking to them for 4 or 6 hours. It's very difficult in most situations, unless you really hit it off. You want to sort of get up and stretch your legs and meet some other people after an hour or 2. And this can be institutionalized, and it sometimes happens by the host simply saying, okay, everybody get up and change places according to this plan that I'm telling you about now. Or every other person gets up and move 3 spaces to the right, something like that. So everybody gets a new dinner partner. That's acceptable. People will say, okay, sure, why not? So little things like that can be done, but you're quite right. Be very careful about not over-facilitating, especially those informal spaces. That can be overdone, and people will say, hey, Miriam, sit down. Right.
And isn't it funny that for a wedding party or big anniversary, it is, again, socially accepted to basically change social norms? It's almost like a game. So we are changing the rules for these hours, and everyone is very happy to follow. And I think for the smaller, more informal events, we even have to be more subtle. And there I realized that sometimes we can just nudge by having, for instance, question cards on the table. And then people automatically ask each other the question. You don't even have to introduce it.
Really? Have you found that?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. So you put cards on a table and you don't say what they're about?
No, and there's a question on it. And then, maybe I'm biased or maybe my friends are biased.
But this has worked with you. So they pick up the card and ask the question.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's nice. I've experienced that too. I have a colleague who does that occasionally, bring question cards. But I've also been in other contexts where when people picked up the card, they dropped it like it was a hot potato because it was felt, I think, like over-facilitating, like, don't you think we can make conversation without your questions? So that's you have to gauge what are the people that you're with and what will they accept under the circumstances. But I agree with you when it starts, people engage in that and they just completely lose themselves in the flow of those questions and answers once the shell is broken open, if you will.
And I think it's the finding the magic check-in question is similar to these questions, because you have to find a balance not to be too superficial or scare someone off and not to go too deep too quickly. Mm-hmm. So it must be an interest. It must be one of those questions that you read and you're like, huh. And then you become curious and then you ask it. But it needs to be such a question.
Yes. And that's a tough one, isn't it? Because how do you match that to the 15 people in your room, and you may have brought 15 questions? Which one is the right one?
Yeah.
But you might say that's the thrill, or that's the magic of it. Can you find questions, starting openers that will match the people in the room?
And then again, when we host a workshop, we know the people who are coming, or we get an understanding of who they are. And if we're inviting 15 guests, you might think we know them even better.
That's true. But they might also be more averse to facilitation.
Yes.
Depending on who they are and how well they know you and how well they respect. Because I find that people are very conscious of when there's too much form, when there's too much process, if you will, and not the freedom to engage in whatever conversation, however I want to do this. If they feel they're being guided when they're off work, off duty, it's very easy for people to feel nudged or even manipulated, and they will rebel against that if there's too much structure. And that's when people say, sit down, stop facilitating. Okay, I won't. Even though you might, and this is something, so what we're talking about now, I would call that meeting design more than facilitation, really, because I tend to think of facilitation as being that which you do live, sort of in the middle of events, as people are talking and you're making a statement or an interjection or a change of course or a comment or a question. That's facilitation. And that you can do if you have a group of 6 friends sitting around a table, or 6 colleagues at lunch, and 4 or 5 of them are taking part of the conversation, and you notice that number 6 is not. And when it's your turn to speak, or whenever you are speaking, you can turn to that person and say, what do you think about this? Or your experience, how's that relevant to this thing here? Just by including people who are not in the conversation at all, by inviting them in ever so discreetly, by asking them a question. And then they will answer the question, and then they'll more readily become part of the group. And I find that to be a very important sort of sub-facilitation skill, to whenever you're in a community, whenever you're in a group of friends or group of people talking, be aware of those who are not in the group, who are standing around, who are sort of looking over our shoulders, who want to take part. Or even if you're at a reception or at a party and you're standing 3 or 4 people talking, and there's another person walking by and looking sort of forlorn or lonely, well, open up the group and include that person. That's a sort of process awareness that you have cultivated as a facilitator, and that you can then apply to regular social interactions, simply by being more aware on a meta level of what's actually going on here.
Yes, absolutely. And this reminds me also of the difference in ability of a facilitator, where some facilitators could sound as if they sound directive. So to order or to point out people, to participants to contribute or to speak up. And others can voice an invitation.
Yes.
For inclusivity.
Yes.
And it creates very different atmospheres and buy-in from the group.
You're quite right. And that's a nice distinction. Well put, that either you're a director ordering people to speak up like a teacher would do. So you've been quiet for the past 45 minutes. What is your position on this? Don't you have anything to contribute? Or simply looking at something, well, what do you think? What is your perspective on this? That's right. Very different ways. And of course, the invitation is the nice way of doing things.
Yes. And it's to be practiced because it needs to come naturally, right?
You're saying it needs to be practiced because it needs to come naturally? I like that. That's a contradiction, but it's very well put that in fact you need to practice in order to sound
to remain natural. And it's thank you for noticing. It is a contradiction, and still I think it's true, because I think the moment we step into a space and we have this responsibility, we tend to tighten up and to lose our authenticity, our natural behavior. And then we practice all of these facilitation skills so that we need to practice to sound natural again.
Yes. But the funny thing is that natural sounds like before you trained it. But natural, of course, also means elegant, flowing with economy, politely, in an invitational manner. And all of those things require some practice. Yeah. And of course, the skilled performer, like a ballet dancer, will dance around on stage and it looks completely natural, which is not, of course, is a result of decades of training. And a musician, it sounds so spontaneous and elegant and graceful. But of course, that is, and you might say with facilitation, it has to be practiced in order to become natural and organic and obvious. And sure, of course, well, yes, right.
Thank you. Good one. Before we move to self-determination theory, what makes a workshop fail, according to you?
Well, in this context, we might say inattention on the part of the facilitator. So I generally put much responsibility on the shoulders of the facilitator, whereas classically people will say, well, participants, they have responsibility to be this and that and do this and that. And that's true, of course. But if we are facilitators and we are in the space of facilitation or talking about facilitation, let's see what a facilitator can do. So if a facilitator hasn't prepared well enough or isn't attentive during the workshop, things may take off in unexpected directions, and they will, unless the facilitator is able to provide the right amount of discrete and friendly structure that invites people to participate in the manner intended by the facilitator. So if there's no structure, people will just throw in whatever they want to talk about, and they will try to capture the attention of the meeting or the workshop and have everybody talk about their interests. And of course, that's very natural, because what I think is important here, I'd like other people to address as well if I'm a participant. And everybody will do that. And that's when we have conflict in meetings and workshops, and people can't disagree and they can't get the ship to sail in the same direction because everybody's paddling in their own direction. And I would say that's the responsibility of the facilitator, to make sure what is the purpose of this gathering and are we on board with that? And here is the structure. First we'll do this, and then we'll do that, and then we'll do that, and then it's over, because then we have a shared understanding of what we're doing. So how about that? When meetings fail, when workshops fail, it's because of inattentive or incomplete facilitation.
And it's interesting that you're mentioning that, because it can have so many different origins. It can either be that the facilitator doesn't dare to intervene, so it's a lack of courage, or the facilitator didn't prepare the structure in advance, so then it's lack of preparedness. Can be lack of guidance during the conversation, or fail to explain what the actual purpose is, so that everyone in the meeting thinks that they're actually speaking on topic, but they have all very different topics in mind.
Yes. And there you mentioned 4 different sub-causes or reasons why a facilitator may fail. And you're quite right. But I would like to think, well, I don't usually think, why do things fail? Because I'm much more concerned with how do they succeed. So it's only like looking back at what meetings and workshops have I participated in that seemed to fail, and why was that? And it's usually due to lack of facilitation, or somebody who's just like keeping a list of speakers, and then people will indicate by raising their hand, and they will be placed on the list of speakers. And then 17 minutes later, they will be their turn, and then they address something that was said 18 minutes previously, and you have these terrible layered conversations with 4 topics being discussed at the same time, because there's no facilitation. There's only somebody who keeps track of who indicates when. And
Yes.
that's a complete abdication of the responsibility of facilitating. So those are the instances where workshops fail.
And it's a beautiful example. The speaking list is a beautiful example how the form shapes the content and shapes also the interaction. Because if we have a speakers list, as soon as I'm on the speakers list, I stop listening to all the other people because I have to focus on what I want to say. Otherwise, I forget it.
Exactly.
So how to kill a fruitful conversation and collaboration is by keeping a speakers list.
Yes. And that's a big challenge when you have a meeting with 10 or 20 people, because so many often will speak at the same time that the meeting manager or the chairperson resorts to keeping a speakers list. And that's sort of when you have given up on focusing this conversation, and you just keep the speed one at a time, like you would at a general assembly of sorts, or a huge formal gathering meeting, a convention, or a meeting of shareholders in a company. And then speakers lists may be appropriate, but not in sort of regular work meetings with 5 or 15 people. You should try and keep the flow of the conversation focused, and let people contribute when they have something relevant to say, and help them hold back when they don't.
Yes. And I was just thinking that maybe sometimes there's a good reason to have these speakers lists. So if there's a shareholder meeting and the chairperson actually doesn't want a fruitful conversation, everyone listening to each other, because this could become uncomfortable for the chairperson, it's a beautiful way to just distract from any uncomfortable questions.
Maybe it's sort of a divide and rule kind of thing. If I just split up this conversation into 50 different little pieces, there will be no coherence and no shared consensus will arise in this, and we can move on and do whatever we want, having had our shareholders meeting now.
Yeah.
But
yeah. That's why I think having the chairperson or the host of a meeting facilitating it, I think, is one of the biggest mistakes teams and companies could do.
I agree.
For that reason.
Get a professional facilitator to do these things, and let the chairperson think about something else and contribute.
Yes. Yes. Beautiful. In our exploration call, you mentioned self-determination theory in the context of discussing why there isn't a theoretical basis for facilitation. And if I remember correctly, you said that self-determination theory is what, in your opinion, comes closest to have the potential to be a theoretical basis for facilitation. And I'm intrigued. So maybe you can just summarize for the audience who might not be familiar with self-determination theory what it is, and then what you meant by it.
Sure. So self-determination theory is a theory of human motivation and personality and development that was inaugurated or started almost 50 years ago by a couple of American research psychologists, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. And it has sort of over the decades since then expanded into a fairly large international research program with hundreds of psychologists and sociologists and other people joining in and using those the central concepts of that theory to investigate many different psychological and social phenomena. And key terms in that theory are intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So it's a motivational psychology also that distinguishes between extrinsic motivation, which is the classical behaviorist sort of, maybe we can get people to do things if we give them rewards or punish them by threats or deadlines or supervision or whatever. So a classic problem in the mid 20th century was with, how do you get factory workers to want to work? How do you get school children to want to go to school? How do we motivate them? So perhaps we can reward them. And we can also maybe do other things, get them tasks that are interesting and make them feel good about themselves and so on. Maybe you can motivate them by piling on all kinds of motivational reward factors. And DC came along in the early 70s and said, well, it's not a matter of quantity of motivation, that the more you pile on, the more motivated people will be. It's more a matter of the quality of motivation. And he distinguished between two different kinds. One is extrinsic and the other is intrinsic. So extrinsic motivation are those things that are different from the activity itself, like rewards and punishments. They're outside the activity. Intrinsic motivation is when you find the activity to be fun or enjoyable or exciting or interesting doing. So if you want to do the activity for its own sake, if you will, not necessarily for its own sake, but because it's fun or interesting to do it, like most people have with their hobbies. People select a hobby because it's nice to do it just for its own sake. You solve crossword puzzles, or you read books, or you play the piano in the basement. You do those things for the intrinsic rewards with it. And then their major accomplishment was to show that extrinsic motivational factors tend to decrease intrinsic motivation. The more you punish or even reward people, the less concerned they will be with doing the activity because it's fun in and of itself. They will tend to think, okay, I'm going to school and I'm learning about Shakespeare and grammar and so on because the teacher wants me to, not because it's interesting in and of itself. So the whole lesson of that was go slow, go easy on extrinsic motivation if you want people to become interested. And usually that's what we want with our kids when they go to school. So don't reward them with money or grades too much. And unfortunately, our whole schooling system is based very much on achieving the right grade. So intrinsic motivation is very, very important, they say. And why is that? Is that because we have some sort of need for being autonomous and self-determined? Is that why we resist extrinsic motivational factors? Is that why we feel manipulated when somebody offers us a reward in order to do something? Yes, they concluded that's what it is. People want to be self-determined, and they call this autonomous, and they started claiming in the 1980s, that maybe people have a need, an inborn need for being autonomous, for deciding for themselves, for being free from external controls and pressures. And that's a very basic point, and everybody agrees, sure, yes, that's the case. So along with the need for autonomy, they also established a need for competence, because if you're autonomous and you can make decisions for yourself and people really want to do that, you also have to have the skill in order to act on that autonomy. And skill is competence. So you develop by being given optimal challenges so you can develop yourself and develop your competence. And they added a third need when they realized that, well, people are not individuals. We do all this in a social context. We're raised by caregivers, and we are surrounded by people all our lives. So all of this happens in a social context. So a need for belonging or relatedness, as they call it, is also a basic human need. So that developed into what they call the basic psychological needs theory, that everybody is motivated by the three needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. That those are major driving factors in people's lives. And to be happy and to flourish and to grow up and to develop into mature human beings, we need to have those needs attended to and cared for when we grow up and when we are young and when we are grown-ups as well. We need to feel autonomous, which is not the same as saying we need to be independent of others. You can be autonomous even if you are given advice by somebody else, even if you enter into bonds and obligations with other people. If you think that those obligations are right for you, and I want to be in this particular social bond with my partner or with my friends, then you are autonomous. Then you are, in a sense, well, they wouldn't say free, but you are self-determined because you have chosen that obligation, that shared fellowship, that community, because you think it is right for you. So people want to be autonomous and competent and feel related to others. And that's the sort of psychological theory context that I have been pondering, as you indicated, might that be an adequate scientific theory or sort of psychological understanding for facilitation, so that we could argue, well, what is it a facilitator does? Well, that's help an assembled group of people, because that's where facilitation is relevant. That's where you facilitate, when you have a group of people together in a room, or gathered together, 5 or 500 people. That's where you do your thing when you facilitate. So could facilitation be understood as what you do when you want to meet people's needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness? So I've been asking myself, is this a way of sort of grounding facilitation and answering the question, what is it really that a facilitator does? Or what should be the purpose of facilitation? Well, help people meet their needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Relatedness is obvious because we're together in a room and we want to do things together and experience this sense of sharedness and community. Competence, well, you may have skills that you can't exercise when you're in a meeting, but still you want to be good. You want to contribute your best. You want to say things that help the group move along, that provide inspirational input to the other people in the group so we can share our experience and our knowledge. That's certainly something you want to do when you're together in a group, in a work situation, for example, where you want to use your skills to accomplish important things in the world. And the facilitator should help everybody challenge each other to grow and to share their knowledge and their skills in such a way that we all become better by being together in this room. And as to the last need, autonomy, well, you want people to feel autonomous in their lives. You want to help them feel that they're sitting in the driver's seat in their own lives. And any group you assemble, any work group or team, you also want them to feel that they can actually do something. They can take charge of their time and their skills and their contributions. We can do something. And this is something that a facilitator is very keen to help the people that are in the room with the facilitator, to have that sense that we can actually do something. We are the masters of our own fates. We can actually make decisions, and we can choose courses of action, and we can do things in the world. We are capable of doing that.
Yes.
As to the opposite, which is keeping people passive and incompetent and fragmented and lonely. And that's what a bad meeting manager or chairperson does when he assembles his group of people. They sit there, they don't talk to each other, they don't know what the other people are, they feel dumb and powerless, incompetent, and they feel, what am I doing here? I'm not controlling my time. I don't know why I'm here. I feel alienated. Nobody sees me. What am I supposed to be doing here? I don't feel autonomous at all. So that's bad facilitation, if you like.
Yeah, thank you. And I immediately thought, while you were describing the relation between self-determination theory and the needs and facilitation, back to our example with the dinner table and the questions. So applying the needs or having them in the back of my head, then this would mean, instead of putting questions there, which is you're giving them the tools and you might restrict them in their autonomy, what would work better, or according to the theory, would be actually to increase intrinsic motivation by making them curious about each other. So what, instead of a question, there would be a fact about the other person. So this would enable then I almost called them participants, the dinner guests, to come up with their own curious question or topic to investigate in the person, and thereby have autonomy. They're in charge of the content and can show their excellence because they're choosing and they're guiding the conversation. And it would create more belonging because everyone feels heard if they're really interested in me, and everyone loves reading a little fact about themselves.
Right. That sounds very nice. And you're sort of applying the self-determination theory concepts to that excellent, intrinsically motivated dinner conversation. But I wouldn't rule out the questions on account of this theory, because one of the ways in which the need for competence can be satisfied according to the theory is by structure, by providing structure. And of course, structure means helping people to handle a particular tool. And you hold the tool here at the handle and not here at the blade, and so on. So providing structure and helping people navigate an open space or an unfamiliar space, it can be very empowering. So giving people a question to ask may also be experienced as providing structure to our conversation. And people may feel, that's nice. I like it when I know what to ask of the person sitting next to me. If I didn't know what to say, then that could be helpful. So, and that's the point, that autonomy is not the opposite of structure. They can go together. So you can feel empowered and able to act if you're given structure, like a question like that. But we can't sort of say in absolute objective terms whether a question put to people on a card, on a table, whether that will be good for people's needs or not. It sort of depends on the situation and all the delicate little contextual factors that go into what makes. But the important thing is to be here, as you were doing yourself when you thought about this, is to be attentive to what is it that people really want? What is it that they really need when they're together? And this is where the theory says, well, they want autonomy and competence and relatedness. And those, I think, are good guidelines for a facilitator. Yeah, if I can cover those bases, I think we're doing a good job here.
Yeah. Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.